My name is Charlie MacLean. I have been researching and writing about whisky for 40 years and have published 18 books on the subject, one of which was named Best Book Wines and Spirits in the 2005 James Beard Awards, the leading gastronomic awards in America. I received a formal training in sensory evaluation in 1992 and have been asked by the Council of Whisky Masters to share my thoughts on this subject with you in this film. As you may know, the Council offers a worldwide education and certification program covering global styles of whisky, and this film's purpose is to set down a simple procedure for anyone who is preparing to study for the Master of Whisky exams, and also to provide a procedure that is universally useful for any whisky lover. I assure you it will enhance your enjoyment and appreciation of the dram in your glass. At the outset, I want to make a distinction between enjoyment, drinking purely for pleasure, and appreciation, thinking about what you're drinking, evaluating flavour and assessing quality in the way professionals in the whisky industry do. It goes without saying that whisky should be enjoyed as you choose, with mixers, in cocktails, with or without ice or water. Appreciation requires an appropriate glass, and I'll come to that in a minute, and often a dash of water, which will open up the aroma and make it easier to taste. The procedure itself is called sensory evaluation, for the simple reason that it employs 4 of our 5 senses: sight, smell, taste, and touch, or texture, called nose feel and mouth feel effects in the trade. In fact, true fact, the flavour is by definition a combination of smell, taste, and texture, touch. It is not just tasting. So today we will consider a simple flight of 3 commonly available Scotch malts and 1 straight bourbon. If possible, you should have your own bottles or samples of these to hand, so we can work together, we can taste together. Working along with me has the advantage that you can validate my tasting notes or observe your separate impressions while assessing the same sample. But failing this, you can get by with 3 Scotch malts, ideally with different flavour profiles, and 1 bourbon from your own collection. The whiskies I've chosen today are they're from 3 different Scotch regions: Glenmorangie from the Highlands, a Talisker from the Isle of Skye, West Coast, and Glenfarclas from Speyside. And the bourbon is Buffalo Trace, a Kentucky straight bourbon. And it's included to demonstrate how the methodology can be applied to non-Scotch whiskies and indeed to tasting blind. The Master of Scotch and the Master of Bourbon exams will explore blind tasting, since knowing the brand tends to set up expectations of its flavour, distracting you from your own thoughts. I'll say something a bit more about this in due course. So let's start. If this were a chemical experiment, this stage would be called apparatus. Now, I mentioned earlier that the glassware is essential. It's essential because you need a glass with a bowl, and more important, where the rim narrows so as to direct the aroma up your nose. These are called spirits nosing glasses. More common now is a similar glass called a Glencairn glass, which is more robust, goes in the washing machine easier. This is called a Riedel glass, or Riedel. George Riedel, a legendary glassmaker, admits that this is his one disaster. It doesn't work for nosing. It's a nice drinking glass because it spreads the liquid across your tongue, but it doesn't narrow to direct the aroma up your nose. When we're tasting blind, we sometimes use dark glasses. Here's a spirits nosing glass in dark blue, and here's a Glencairn glass when in almost black. It's very, very dark blue. And here are another couple of examples, a very elegant tall glass with the rim narrowing. And this is a very old-fashioned glass with a big bowl, which allows even more swirling. A brandy snifter is okay, but a small brandy snifter it should be, not a great big balloon. So glassware, samples, The next thing that I recommend is that you have a glass of water to cleanse your palate between tasting, and that you also have a pipette to add a little water to the sample. The water itself should be cool, but not icy. And indeed, the samples should be at so-called room temperature. What else? Oh, and then finally, a little whiskey notebook. This is my little, which I was sent. It's a rather nice little book to take to record your thoughts and tasting notes. Now, if you've got 4 glasses, pour your samples now, because it's a good idea to let them rest and develop in the glass, and then shortly we'll start to assess them. A very useful tool, especially when you're assessing aroma, is the flavour wheel. Here it is. This is the wheel that was developed by Pentland's Scotch Whisky Research in the late 1970s. The idea behind it was to develop a flavour vocabulary which could be shared right across the industry at all, and I quote here now, at all stages of Scotch whisky production by distillers and by blenders. Note, it wasn't designed for consumers. They came up with this device to display their findings of a wheel, and they're almost certainly the first group of scientists to do so, although the device was soon adopted and adapted by other industries: wine, beer, rum, coffee, chocolate, etc. As I say, the wheel was for the trade only, but has formed the basis in a simplified form to assist consumers to identify aromas. Now, a wheel which I developed has a rim. It has a rim of 8 segments, the cardinal aromatic groups: grainy, grassy, fragrant, fruity, etc. Beneath this, they're divided up into, in the case of grainy, cereal, malty. In the case of peaty, for example, smoky, medicinal, and I've put in maritime. And then underneath that is the full list. So grainy breaks down. These are the sort of descriptors that you might come up with at a tasting. So grainy comes breakfast cereal, porridge, grits, bran, toast, digestive biscuits, coffee. Malt, the 2 underneath grainy, malted milk, malt barn, dried hops, Horlicks, Marmite. I don't know if Marmite and Horlicks are available in America, and so on. So the key thing is it's a tool. Use your own language, develop your own vocabulary. The tool it's useful to give you an idea of the sort of things that we might pick up. But we'll explore this as we go along. So, having got all your kit worked out, let's move now to the tasting procedure. The tasting procedure follows what I mentioned earlier. It follows the 4 senses. Indeed, you might even say 5. I'll come to that in a minute. So, our 4 senses: sight. We use our eyes to look at the appearance of the whisky, which embraces colour, it embraces legs, I'll explain all this, clarity, and a phenomenon called beading. This is all under sight. Smell, aroma, or nose, as we say in the whisky trade, is both analytical and hedonic. I'll explain these terms. And this is where the blenders and people working with whisky all the time use their noses. They rarely put the liquid in their mouths. They get all the information they require from the aroma. The third sense is taste. This is to do with mouthfeel, texture, and the overall taste, primary tastes. Again, I'll explain it. And touch, which is expressed as mouthfeel effect, nosefeel effect, and it might be it's aftertaste as well. I'm going to look at it under the heading aftertaste. So those are your 4 senses and how they are applied to sensory evaluation. The only missing sense, of course, is hearing. Some would say that when you take the cork out of a bottle and you pour it and it goes, and you know it's a full bottle, that's a very comforting sound. Some also would say that the tinkle of ice in the glass is another comforting sound. And I knew a distillery manager at Dalwhinnie Distillery many years ago, and he could identify by sound alone whether the spirit he was made in the wintertime or in the summertime, because in the wintertime it was more what's the word? It was thicker and more viscous. That's the word I'm looking for. So hearing, but really for our purposes, we use the remaining four senses. The first whisky we're going to look at is a Highland whisky, Glenmorangie, very well known, very popular, best-selling malt in Scotland apparently. 10 years old at 43% alcohol by volume. With this sample, I'm going to focus on aroma. We'll look at appearance, taste and aftertaste in greater detail later. The nose is our most important organ in assessing flavour. Blenders, as I mentioned, very rarely taste the liquid. They may consider hundreds of samples a day, and tasting will blunt their palates and swallowing lead to alcoholic dependence, I'm afraid to say. I'll expand upon the miracle of the nose later at the end of this talk. In the meantime, I want to quote from a little book which was commissioned by Glenmorangie in 1984. Here we are, let me see if I can find my quote. They sent samples to two leading fragrance houses, Belmay in New York and La Roche, Christian La Roche in Paris, and also to Pentlands, who I referred to a moment ago. Pentlands identified 20 aromas, Saint Roche 36, Belmay 33, but less than half the aromas identified by the three expert panels coincided. The late Dr. Jim Swan, let me quote from this directly, Dr. Jim Swan, Operations Director at Pentlands, and by the way, my mentor, he commented, and I quote, "It may reasonably be argued that amongst malt whiskies, Glenmorangie has the best balance fragrance spectrum. Edward Schwartz, head perfumer at Belmay, felt that the discrepancy between the three teams was quite natural difference between experts. He would have been far more surprised if their pronouncements had concurred exactly. So do not be shy about using your own descriptors. There are no rights and wrongs about how you describe aroma." Belmay and Saint Roche are both perfume houses, and I find it quite useful sometimes to use the language of perfume when I'm exploring aroma. They talk about top notes, mid notes or heart notes, and base notes. So when we come to nose this, which we'll do in a minute, think of what are the first notes, the first aromas that you might come upon. What's below that, and what's done at base. That's the perfumer's way of doing it. So now let us apply the procedure to looking at this Glenmorangie. Then at that stage up will come the four stages. So swirl it in the glass. First of all, look at the colour. This is a beautiful golden colour, and this is classic American white oak. It's a good idea to warm the liquid in the hand a little bit. If it's as cold, this is quite cold. That'll open it up a bit. And then what do you smell? There's something overall fruity for me. I often get mandarin with Glenmorangie. Yeah, zest, mandarin zest, orange zest possibly. It's a sweet aroma and very faintly floral. This is where your wheel comes in. If you go through, am I getting any grainy notes? Am I getting any floral notes? Am I getting any fruity notes? And if I'm detecting fruity notes, are they fresh fruits, tinned fruits, etc.? Well, let me tell you what the three expert panels discovered in the aroma of Glenmorangie 10 years old. Almond. This is where they coincided. The almond, green apple, cinnamon, clove, hay, lemon peel, licorice, honey, orange, plum, raisins, rose, and vanilla. Well, so now we get to taste for the first time. What I usually do is to take a sip of water, especially when I'm tasting straight. And the first thing I think of is texture. And then I think of the 5 primary tastes, including savoury, which we'll discuss as we go along next with the next whiskey. And then finish, which is simply short, medium, or long. This I would say is medium. And aftertaste. Aftertaste here, I would say fruity, just broadly speaking. Now let's add a drop of water. It's at 43% alcohol, so you don't need to add very much water. And see if it opens it up. Again, hold it in the hand and warm it a bit. Yeah, now I think I'm getting a faintly dry hay smell. It is still quite closed, actually. That's that's a wine term, but it's not giving much away. But it's nose drying. The nose feel effect is nose drying. Oh, now then, what did I get? Hessian burlap. Yep, and there is a very slight grainy note, I'm thinking of just loose grain, actually. It looks sort of a grain loft. And now to tasting at reduced strength. This time hold it for longer in your mouth. A lovely, soft, creamy mouthfeel. Light sweetness, very light acidity. I'll describe this better as we go along on the next one, actually. But the whole thing is very, very satisfying. Easy to drink, not terribly challenging, and just a very pleasant, middle-of-the-road malt whiskey. Right, tasting number 2 is Talisker, 10 years old. Talisker, known as the lava of the Coolin, and we'll find out why. The Coolin is the mountains on the Isle of Skye. It's a West Coast whiskey on the famous and wild Isle of Skye. The distillery is right by Loch Harport. It's right very close to the sea, and its motto is "Made by the Sea." And you'll find, I think, various maritime characteristics when we go through the tasting. Talisker is always bottled at a slightly higher strength than usual. In this case, it's 45.8% alcohol by volume. And it says ruggedly maritime, sweet smoke, peat, pepper. Well, we'll see. So pour yourself a sample, I hope you've already done so. And let's look at it. It's slightly darker, you'll see, than the Glenmorangie. That is maybe because they're using a mix of casks. I'll talk about colour in the next whiskey that we look at, the appearance, but it'll be a mix of casks. Now, the nose, the first thing you must agree with is that the aroma is very different from Glenmorangie. This is, well, do you get what I mean by maritime? For me, it's salt crystals, salt spray, salty wind, possibly beaches, possibly seaweed. And there is something mineralic like chalk or slaked lime. Fresh, clean, and then in the back, if you like, the base note is faintly smoky. At 45.8%, there is a very slight nose feel effect, a very slight prickle. Again, unlike Glenmorangie. And we'll probably take that off when we add a little drop of water. But so having done the nose, then let's have a look at the taste. Again, I suggest that you have a sip of water tasting straight. And then see what you can make of this. A very light sweetness, a distinct salinity, saltiness at the sides of the tongue, perhaps a tiny bit of acidity. And then one of the keynotes of Talisker is this sort of chili pepper catch at the back of the throat, just as you swallow. A longer and more warming finish than the Glenmorangie. There's something elemental about Talisker. There's something sort of wide open spaces, or it's very much a spirit of place. A lot of malt whiskies they seem to echo the situation in which the location in which they're made, and Talisker is one. So add a little bit of water again to hopefully bring up the aroma and make it easier to hold in the mouth. It's the saltiness and mineralic quality on the nose is still there. And the finish is slightly longer than the Glenmorangie. Well, let me expand a little bit more about taste, or as it's called in the trade, flavour by mouth. Because remember, I've said that flavour is a combination of smell, taste, and texture. So this is flavour by mouth. So the first thing to note when you're tasting a whiskey is the whiskey's texture, the physical effect it has on the palate. This is called mouthfeel, as I mentioned. Is it smooth, creamy, mouth-filling, cooling, mentholic, warming, spicy, acerbic, astringent, alcoholic, as in high strength? Well, think of all these things. Next, you look at the liquid's primary tastes. And this is better done at reduced strength, especially when the whiskey is relatively high strength like this Talisker. So you can hold the liquid in your mouth comfortably. Don't be shy. Blenders typically reduce the strength to 20% alcohol by volume, which I actually find too low. A good guide is the nose feel I mentioned earlier. Add enough to take off any prickle. The important thing about the water you add is that it should be taste and odour free, no trace of chlorine, etc. Tap water in Edinburgh here is fine, but you're better to play safe with bottled water and go for soft water with a pH of 7 or below rather than hard water. It should be cool, around about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and not ice. Ice closes down the aroma. So now I'm going to add a little bit more water. And then we can look again at the primary taste is simply sweet, sour, oblique acidic, salty, bitter, and umami, which is savoury. Broadly speaking, sweetness is identified at the front of the tongue, acidity and saltiness at the sides, the receptors are mixed up, and bitterness at the back. You shouldn't find bitterness in many whiskies. Savoury is found across the whole palate. Take a good sip. Squish it about around your mouth. Take time to concentrate on what parts of your tongue are being stimulated. Here, by the way, smokiness, tannic dryness might enter the equation. These are not primary tastes. And now I'm going to have another sip and refresh the glass a bit and look at the more subjective, after having done the objective exploration of primary tastes, let's look at the subjective. What does it remind you of? It reminds me of beach bonfires. It reminds me of Talisker, but the barbecues, possibly. Goes very well with oysters, Talisker, raw, but it doesn't. The flavour isn't apart from the saltiness. Is not giving anything away. Yeah, and it's got that lovely, that peppery spiciness as you swallow. Again, leave a little in the glass to compare. In fact, you might go back and look at the Glenmorangie again. Oh, no. The nose of the Glenmorangie, it's now gained a sort of chocolate note. Even, dare I say it, chocolate orange. You know, those milk chocolate flavoured with orange. And Talisker is much more elemental, more rocky, more mineralic. Whiskey number 3 is a Glenfarclas 105 cask strength. Now, have a look at the label. It says 105. Now, 105 refers to the degrees of alcohol imperial proof, not American proof. It's imperial proof, so it's 105 degrees proof. American proof and imperial proof, UK proof is different. It describes itself as a Highland malt. In truth, it's a Speyside malt, but Speyside was not identified legally until 2009 as it was formerly a division of Highland, so it's an old-fashioned style. The 60%, you can see down here, 60% ABV, and the 105 proof, that 105 degrees is 60% alcohol. Cask strength, it says. Now, that should be what it says. It's the spirit when it comes out of the cask. But it's not legally defined. And so it might be, I don't know whether they've reduced it a tiny bit. Usually when it comes out of the cask, that would be about right. So they probably, because it goes into the cask, it typically goes into the cask prior to maturation at 63.5%. And the strength comes down during maturation. I don't know the age of this whiskey, but I guess it's probably about 10 years old. Now let's look at the whiskey. Under appearance, we will consider colour, strength, and viscosity. New Make Spirit, cannot be named whiskey until it's matured for at least 3 years, has no colour. Here's an example. It draws colour from the cask in which it matures. The cask must be made from oak. Two species of oak are used: American white oak and European oak. Each leaves a slightly different colour to the whisky, which we'll talk about. Casks are used more than once, except in America, where if you're calling a whisky a straight rye or a straight bourbon, they have to be filled into brand new casks. So they may be used, and in Scotland they may be used more than once, and each time they're used, the colour will fade. And indeed, to further confuse things, many whiskies, probably most whiskies, use a mix of wood types. So I mentioned that the American oak, well, that would be a typical colour from a fine, rich, new, first fill sort of oak cask, whereas that is an example of a refill cask, i.e. one that's been used 2 or 3 times. See, it's much paler. It's still gold, but it's much paler. That's also, well, that's also a good American oak colour. This golden colour. That is an extreme example. It's a very old whisky, actually. That's a MacLean 1988. That's a good example, as is that. This is a Glendronach of European oak maturation. The much darker and more mahogany. And again, as with the American oak maturation, it fades as the more time the cask has been used. So the colour comes from the wood. It doesn't come from the first incumbent. The whiskies, the casks used by the Scotch whisky industry, they're invariably, I mean, except for a few exceptions, invariably second-hand. So they've been seasoned, in the case of American oak barrels coming from the bourbon makers, rye makers, mainly bourbon, so they've been seasoned with bourbon in this case. And in the case of European oak, it's commonly seasoned with sherry. Now, I say seasoned, I mean they literally are. They're not ex solera, or very rarely ex solera. They are seasoned for a specified period of time, usually between a year and 4 years, according to the style that the whisky maker wants. To further confuse matters, the Scotch whisky industry is permitted to add small amounts of spirit caramel, E150A apparently, food colouring, to achieve uniform hue colour from batch to batch, which makes it, frankly, impossible to guess the wood type. So that's colour. Let's now look at clarity. Most whiskies are polished, so-called, prior to bottling, to keep the liquid bright and clear when water or ice are added. This is done by a process called chill filtration. Without it, some whiskies may become faintly hazy, caused by compounds called fatty esters and lipids. I won't try it because it probably has been polished. To prevent this, the liquid is chilled to around freezing, which causes the lipids to precipitate, then press it through a bank of paper sheets like blotting paper, which will collect the precipitated particles. This is all very well cosmetically, but these fatty esters and lipids contribute much to flavour and especially to mouthfeel, and are best left in. Indeed, nowadays, many brand owners make a virtue of saying on the label, non-chill filtered. The third aspect of, we're still on appearance. We've done colour, we've done clarity, and now I'm looking at viscosity, which can also sometimes give an indication of strength. In the old days, a common way of assessing quality was called the beading test. Crude, but relatively effective. If you take a bottle of whiskey at standard strength, so this is 43%, and shake it, it fizzes, but it doesn't last. Talisker, holds a little bit more, but still away. But if you look at this, remember I said this is 60% alcohol. Look at that. That tells you that the liquid is approximately over 50% alcohol, and it's pretty well infallible. If we take this one, see, there we are. The foam. The foam is called beading, and the interesting thing which I've discovered is through repeated testing, is that it doesn't, you don't get beading over about 50% alcohol, but you don't, it's not necessarily connected to high strength. Now this bottle of new make spirit is at 63%. This is foams, but vanishes very quickly. And younger whiskies, so in effect, when a whiskey is older, it holds the bead longer. And so that was why it's a very useful but crude way of assessing strength and, to some extent, age. Oh, and then the other thing on this business of assessing viscosity is to swirl the whiskey in the glass. You need to warm this up a tiny bit, but if you swirl it and then look at the legs, the trickles that come down. Broadly speaking, I can't even see them in this light, but if they're thick and slow, it's indicating that it'll have more texture in the mouth, and if they're skinny and fast running, they would tend to be slightly less texture. Not a quality comment. It's not a comment on quality, but it is a comment on the likely mouthfeel. So now, at last, so we've done appearance on this Glenfarclas. Warm it a little bit in the hands. Remember, it's relatively high strength. And nose it. Oh, now that's very interesting. By its colour, I'm guessing there's a fair amount of European oak, and that's confirmed for me on the nose. European oak often gives for me, a smell of fruit loaf with sultanas, and it's there. It's also, you can tell by the nose feel effect that it's high strength. Even if you didn't know it was high strength, it's really quite prickly and quite nose warming, if you like. Yeah. So it's all dried fruits for me. It's Christmas cake, as I say, malt loaf. Dried figs. Your imagination run riot in terms of dried fruits. So sultanas are my top note here. Could be raisins, certainly figs, might be prunes. John Grant, the owner, writes, no, he doesn't. He suggests adding a little water. So let's do that. Oh, have a taste straight first. Again, a sip of water before you taste, at least I do. It's slightly nose drying as well. This tannic, the European oak is much more tannic, and as in, think of tea. You know, it's more tannic than American oak. American oak is generally sweeter, produces a sweeter product, and it is nose drying. So in the mouth, ooh. Now, again, it's lightly sweet. Speyside whiskies tend to be sweeter than other whiskies. But this is very lightly sweet. Centre palate. There's not much stimulation at the sides of the tongue. But as you swallow, there's a spiciness. In fact, there's a spiciness right across the tongue. And as you swallow, did you get a very slight taste of cordite, struck matches? It's very slightly sulphurous. And again, that's not uncommon with European oak casks. This slight sulphur note. Nobody really knows where it comes from, but what causes it. And at this level, it's perfectly acceptable. If it at much higher, it becomes oppressive. Do you notice? You smell it now. I'm smelling that the struck matchbox. So now let's try some water. That's calmed it down and taken away that slightly struck match. And in the mouth, opens it up, sweeter. The slightly more tannic and more spicy. The recommendation to add water is absolutely right. With a whiskey at this strength, it really benefits from the addition of water. So I'm going to add a tiny bit more to my glass, and then we'll move on to the fourth sample. I'll add some water to that because I'm going to come back and do a comparison. In fact, we might do that now. So have another sniff of your Glenfarclas. Then look at the Talisker. Has this changed much? Has the Talisker changed much? I think it's become more smoky. Yeah. Distant bonfire. Or smouldering. Yeah, smouldering peat fire. Oh, so much sky. And Glenmorangie. That has collapsed somewhat. Although it's still quite pleasant, but I'm getting like wallpaper paste. See, there are no pejoratives when you're describing aroma. Sweeter now to taste. Delicious. And those mandarin that I mentioned right at the very start, they're coming through in the taste now. Number 4 whiskey is a straight Kentucky bourbon at 40% alcohol by volume. Before we start tasting it and exploring it, let me say something about the distillery. Buffalo Trace is huge and rambling. The site in Franklin County, Kentucky, stretches over 130 acres. It was founded in 1775, which is very early, under another name, and it claims thus to be the oldest continuously operating distillery in America. The brand and distillery name, which has been used only since 1995, comes from the fact this place across the Kentucky River was a ford used since time immemorial by hordes of buffalo. The essential difference between Scotch malt whisky and American whisky is that while the former is made only from malted barley, the latter uses a mix of grains: corn for sweetness and mouthfeel, rye for spice and acidity, and wheat for delicacy and mellowness, as well as malted barley for enzymes, which convert the starch into sugars. The grains are used in different proportions, called the mash bill, which gives rise to different flavour profiles from the same distillery. There's no such thing as regional identity in American whiskey. Indeed, it's somewhat misleading in even malt whiskey, Scotch malt. I'll discuss this later. Now you'll see that it has a lovely sort of autumn gold colour. It's sort of beech trees in the fall. Polished mahogany, whatever. The colour, as I said to you earlier on, is coming from, because the spirit, when it goes into the cask, is white, pure white spirit. And it gets the colour, it draws the colour from the cask. By law, in order to, if it's going to be described as, again, I think I mentioned this, the straight bourbon, straight rye, it has to be filled into brand new, fresh oak casks, all American oak. And the American oak can be grown anywhere in the world, but of course it's principally grown in America. And the Quercus alba, it's called white oak, American white oak. So the colour's coming from the oak, and that the fresh oak. These casks are extremely, they call them very active casks. And so a lot of the flavour in American whiskey, particularly in straight whiskies, is derived from the oak itself. This is by design. This is not accidental. So we've got this gorgeous colour. It's 40%. It's relatively low strength, and so we can look at the legs. We can look at the bead, which won't bead. Nope, look at the way it fizzles away. No problem. But and then when we nose it, the immediate impression is of oak, fresh, planed oak. Lovely. But quite, kind of quite overpowering, the oakiness. What I would also expect to find in bourbon or in fresh oak, bourbon in particular, is vanilla and what they call oak lactones, which is both oaky flavours but also coconut. And I think I'm certainly getting the vanilla, but this is the oakiness and then backed by vanilla, and then on a base, is any coconut? Not for me at the moment. A lot of American whiskies, even straight bourbon, straight rye, are designed to be drunk with mixers. Ginger ale's a very good mixer. Coke, I find a little bit overpowering, but and certainly drunk over ice. But there is a complexity there that is often mixed when you're just drinking for enjoyment. They are dare I say it, they're not as complex as Scotch malts, but they're immensely satisfying. Right, so let's taste straight. Get a nice texture. Oak to start with. Sweet. Some little twist at the sides of the tongue. Spicy rather than salty or acidic. Shortish finish. Yeah. Aftertaste of oak. All by design, all by design. It's very nice, very nicely balanced. It's sort of easy drinking. Add a little bit of water. And see how the nose has been, whether it's opened up or not. A little bit, but not much. There's no change. There's not much change. That's another thing that you might think about, is whether the aroma changes much at reduced strength when you add a drop of water. Now, my idea for this fourth whiskey was to look at aftertaste, somewhat contrived, but still. Not all whiskies leave an aftertaste, but if they do, it should ideally match what has come before, aroma and taste, and should be pleasant. Does Buffalo Trace leave any aftertaste? Yes, emphatically, oak, and that reflects the aroma and the taste. A related phenomenon is the development of the whisky, how the aroma develops, and we'll check that in a moment when we look at our samples. I'm often asked whether Scotch is better than any other whiskies. The answer is that none is necessarily better than another. They are different by design, and the differences may be explored and appreciated as we have been doing today. Considerable care and craft goes into their creation, and this should be respected. Sometimes they can be disappointing, failing to deliver what you might expect or hope for. Very occasionally you come across a faulty bottle, usually because of the cork, as a matter of fact, as in wine. But there's an old saying in Scotland, there's no bad whiskey, just good whiskey and better whiskey. It is said that for overall satisfaction, the whiskey, whether it be Scotch or bourbon, should deliver what it promises. With experience, the appearance sets up expectations. The aroma should confirm these, and the taste deliver what you now expect. Of course, like wine, there are happy and disappointing surprises. A closed nose and splendid taste, a fragrant nose, and whatever. But this tasting regime should allow you to assess this, hopefully, generously, objectively. Quality, an ill-defined term, except by advertising, is more subjective than objective. Like beauty, it is in the eye of the beholder, or in this case, the palate of the taster. The author of the Tane Conundrum, my wee book, which I mentioned earlier, concludes, perhaps the most important of all, when you put down your pencil and notepad, halt the critical analysis and simply sit back and enjoy the whisky. As we say in Scotland, Sancha, good health. So that's the end of the course, if you like. But I thought I would add some afterthoughts. First, where flavour comes from. Flavour in mature whisky comes from three sources: raw materials, process, that contributes to what's called distillery character, and maturation, which is called mature character. While each distillery produces or is obliged to produce a unique character of spirit, and increasingly a variety of characters, i.e. smoky, non-smoky from the same site, let alone in America where they produce a whole huge variety. This is modified by maturation, even up to 80% of the overall mature flavour, some claim. Older whiskies tend to merge flavour-wise and lose their initial distillery character, so it's almost impossible to guess their origin. Remarkably, the flavour-bearing molecules, they're called congeners, account for a mere 0.3% of the liquid in the bottle, and that is approximately the depth of the meniscus in a full bottle. The rest being ethyl alcohol and water, both of which are described as being organoleptically inert. They don't have any aroma or taste. Not only does this tiny amount differentiate one malt from another, it identifies whiskey from whiskey, with an E, American whiskey, and other brown spirits. Vodka, being much purer and therefore comparatively tasteless, typically contains approximately 0.03 congeners. Water. Until relatively recently, it was believed that it was the process water that distinguished one whiskey from another. When asked in 1953 by Time magazine in the US what made the Glenlivet special, he replied, "I think it's all to do with the water and some fiddle-faddle in the production process." Of course, water plays a crucial role in the making of whiskey. Without it, you cannot distill. And increasingly, with climate change, distilleries have to close during exceptionally dry spells, even in Scotland, would you believe? It's essential for mashing, this is called process water, distillation, called cooling water, the water that's in the condensers to cool the spirit, the vapour, and dilution, called reduction water, used to reduce the strength of the spirit prior to putting it into cask. If any of these waters contribute to flavour, frankly, it is minuscule. The largest impact is the water you add to your dram in the glass. I promised I would expand upon smell. Our sense of smell is truly miraculous. We commonly detect odours diluted down to a few parts per million, in some cases in parts per billion, and in the case of a few extremely pungent molecules, occasionally found in whisky, in parts per trillion. The last is equivalent to a drop of water in an Olympic swimming pool. While we are equipped with around 9,000 taste buds, we have between 50 and 100 million olfactory receptors. While there are only 5 primary tastes and 3 primary colours, it has been estimated that there are over 30 primary aromas. Then there's the contentious subject of the Scotch whisky regions. The first regional division was introduced in 1784 for tax reasons. A notional diagonal line was drawn across the country. Above it was the Highland region, below it the Lowlands. And this was done for tax purposes. Different duties and other legal requirements were applied to distilling above and below the Highland line, so-called. By the 1890s, the leading blending houses were categorising their filling whiskies, the whiskies they wanted for their blends, by region, which varied from blender to blender, but only slightly. The 4 acknowledged regions were Highland, Lowland, as previously, Campbelltown and Islay. Only much later was Speyside added. The idea of associating flavour differences with regions began much later and was always loose. However, it took off in the 1980s, largely driven by marketers and publishers to communicate the fact that all malts, all Scotch malt whiskies, are different in a manner familiar to wine drinkers, familiar with the concept of the wines of Bordeaux, etc. The concept is by no means infallible, and increasingly distillers are exploring different styles of spirit from a single distillery. Some peated malts are made on Speyside, which is usually associated with non-peated spirit, and indeed some non-peated whiskies have long been made on Islay, which is renowned for its peaty style. So it's not infallible by any means. The truth is that it's not location, terroir, that dictates the style of a whisky. It is tradition backed by science nowadays. And where there is no tradition, the newcomers to the industry can explore flavour as they choose, wherever their distilleries are located. And this makes for a very interesting development. It makes for a very interesting development and a whole increase in flavours, a potential, you know.